Yeah, I know. Let's get this over with. At an unprecedented time where people are actually talking about Chinese animation for a change, and I just happen to be in one of those areas where that movie has not been playing, I might as well mention a franchise that I haven't talked about yet and admittedly still have very limited information on, which was, at least until this year, China's most successful animated theatrical franchise, the Boonie Bears. And then Neja 2 came along and pretty much by itself made more than all of them put together. But I'll still add it if only for some obscure, semi-popular Chinese pop culture. That from what I get started out as a fairly child-oriented semi-Looney Tunes scenario involving two bears and a park ranger that gradually over time just started getting more and more insane with magic and time travel and aliens and so on. If I looked at these movies back in, say, the early 2010s, the movies do just look like your kind of standard, regular, disposable streaming fodder. Like, you look back at the animation from the original series and yeah, it literally looks like a PS1 game. And then all of a sudden became major action movies on the same level of many of the fantasy gods and demons historical films they get. And that leads us to 2024's Time Twist, only in this one, the Ranger is the main character. Was initially started out as a cartoonish fool of an adversary who eventually became a friend and ally to the bears. But in this movie, he greatly regrets the life that he's chosen as a park ranger and wishes that he had the way more successful life of working in an office cubicle and living in a studio apartment. You know, because of the often disparity of the economic opportunities that exist between country and the city that are pretty universal, but tend to be way more pronounced or at least addressed in Chinese films, whereas in America, the country is way more romanticized. But that emotional hook is surprisingly effective. Anyway, he makes a deal with a time-traveling wizard to go back and change the way his life was, only to predictably regret and want to go back to the way things were, only for the climax, and this is the real hook, so I'm just gonna go ahead and spoil it, basically turns into Avengers Endgame, because even without seeing the rest of the series, there are suddenly all of these characters showing up out of the time stream that I'm guessing are side characters from the other movies or the series, that all come in for this giant time battle, where just from the sheer scale is genuinely impressive. I can't say that anything about this necessarily hooks me into getting invested into the franchise itself, it still feels very kid-oriented, but at least I understand why these movies have gotten such big returns. While unfortunately there didn't appear to be much in the feature-length animated horror sphere, to keep up the tradition of having at least one entry that reminds people that Shudder exists, one of the notable horror movies of the year was an exclusive called Stopmotion, literally about a stop-motion artist who is taunted by a child that her characters won't feel real unless they're made out of real material. I pretty much threw this in here for fun, but in truth, I think that this movie is a bit more shock than substance. It's got a really good tense build-up, but then it gets kinda gross and abstract. Though some stop-motion artists might be able to relate to feeling unappreciated and slowly going insane. The most recent My Hero Academia movie, You're Next, makes me feel like the subtitles of every single My Hero Academia movie at some point were randomized. They always feel like they would be better suited to another movie. I also expect that this was probably the movie that probably had the less attention than the other ones, given that My Hero Academia's manga run recently ended, and many people were unenthused by its finale. To me, it was kind of expected, but perfectly acceptable. It wasn't like it was Bleach. They've been fun, but I've never had any of the My Hero Academias rock my world aside from the usual over-the-top action in the finale. This one I feel like its personal story of one character trying to save someone they care about from being manipulated, that personal hook made this one a little bit more enjoyable than some of the others. Which is also odd that that's what I remember from it, given that the entire hook of this movie is that they go up against evil All Might. You would have thought that that would have left a bigger impression than it did. I very much have enjoyed Craig of the Creek as a series, and it is a genuine loss that it has recently come to an end. And I am eternally grateful for its existence as this generation's kids play acting their own society premise following Recess and Kids Next Door, elevating the stakes of play areas into full territorial battles. So its origin story movie about Craig first arriving at the creek and making his friends honestly made me feel more sad. but definitely like you want to watch the series over, which is really the point. And of course, the movie is filled with instances like, of course the MacGuffin is a paper fortune teller. Oh, there's that character before their glow up. Where did these kids get a full pirate ship? Oh, it's a blow up pirate ship. Where did they get a full blow up pirate ship? And yet, I just can't help but feel that it fails to meet the epic levels of the Capture the Flag War. In contrast, I haven't seen a whole lot of Big City Greens, though I have enjoyed what I've seen. The general hook of the characters being farmers in the city, and that the main character is a bit of a selfish git. But likely because I hadn't seen so much of its series, made its movie, more so a musical movie, feel so much more impressive. Cricket uses his wiles essentially to trick his family into being experimental farmers on a space station, which will of course put him in especially hot water when things go wrong this time. At a time where I'm increasingly disappointed in a lot of musicals, I'm happy that Spacecation is simple but effective. But the really big, way too relevant hook is that the villain is literally the CEO of Big Tech, who considers human lives expendable as long as they can get revenge on the people who ridiculed them when they were younger. Yeah, real-life supervillains really are as cartoonish as the cartoon supervillains, they're just not always literally singing about it. The sense that I get from that Christmas is that it was sort of going for a child-friendly, similarly formatted of another titular British Christmas classic, Love Actually, which was notable considering that this is a movie that mocks Love Actually for being such a repetitive British Christmas staple. That it follows many vaguely interconnected stories around children living in the same neighborhood getting caught in a big storm. It also gives a good dose of Home Alone, as the blizzard has separated the kids from their parents. I do like the bonds the kids have with the other people in the neighborhood, but as far as new Christmas classics go, I like the one with the owl a lot better. Wait, was that 24? That was 24, I could have added it. It's stop motion, it's really cute. Everyone's speaking English, but nobody understands each other. They're all speaking their, animal language. I am well beyond my Haikyuu phase at this point, the famous volleyball anime that single-handedly resurrected volleyball in Japan. It was one of the biggest things in anime about 5 years ago, and I fell off it even before its manga concluded. But of course I was gonna come back for the garbage battle. I won't go into why it's called the garbage battle. No, it's not that complicated. The two rival teams, their mascots are a crow and a cat, which are typically animals that fight in dumpsters. That's pretty much the reason. It's a long-awaited legacy battle between two of the main teams in Haikyuu, but teams that are on very friendly terms with each other, including having multiple training sessions alongside each other. And it's one of the things I have really appreciated about sports anime. It's how much it emphasizes the positive incarnation of the competitive spirit, where your opponent can also genuinely be your best friend, but you're genuinely invigorated by the challenge. A sentiment that just seems to be completely absent in America, where your enemy has to be nothing short of Satan's minions that you must defeat for moral purposes. And it always manages to bring very pivotal moments in their games back to something very personal in the characters. And while for a while I still didn't completely get why someone who was way more into video games would even want to do volleyball, but this movie definitely made me get that character. And it reminded me why I like this show, mostly because the characters are really funny. However, the fact that this is a movie is actually a little bit of a letdown to the fan base, because as one of the most awaited battles, they wanted it to be a full season like Shiratorizawa in season 3. And instead, it gets shortened into a movie, and as a result, certainly in comparison to that, it didn't quite have the same level of hype. I still enjoyed it, and even kind of appreciated that it was a little shorter, but I certainly get that disappointment. One of the oldest superheroes in Japan's history finally gets an Americanized animated film, which is mostly about him babysitting a kaiju as a representation of his own internal battles between being angry at his parents and his responsibility of carrying on the family legacy of being Ultraman and his fondness of being a famous baseball player. I don't know much about Ultraman, but I'm pretty sure that none of it involved any of this. It's an interesting angle given its premise. That this got nominated for the Annies is nice and understandable. I just personally would have probably put some others there in its place. I don't exactly know how DreamWorks got away with calling this a special production, giving it its own notable spotlight in the Annie Awards. I guess any one-off production technically counts as long as it premiered directly on streaming, and then it's just a matter of what categories the studios consciously submit them for. But then it also won television writing. Well, I guess considering its competition, and I guess Arcane won everything else. Well, at least it got something, because I do think it deserves something. Had it been in theaters, I think that people would genuinely give it its chops more. But it's also understandable that people tend to forget that this exists when its premise does read as a very B version of Inside Out, or Rise of the Guardians, in terms of making manifestations of childhood concepts that this movie personifies things that happen at night. But because it tends to surround itself with things that make children scared, I still consider it a very interesting take on childhood fears, with an interesting narrative framework that this is a story that the protagonist is telling to his child way into the future until that child itself becomes an active participant in the story. I like it when family movies have a different methodology of doing that kind of fourth wall breaking narrative tweak. It definitely deserves better than to just be forgotten, but I also understand why. I've alluded before that I have never been a Transformers person, and have never properly watched any of its animated incarnations, and only saw the first Bayformers, and only watched a billion videos about how terrible the others were. And while this movie hasn't converted me in any significant way, I can't deny that I have immense respect for this movie, where its own studio seemed to throw it under the bus by giving it a fairly underwhelming trailer compacted with some very predictable cringe kid humor that admittedly did keep this movie from rising anymore in my ranks, while the actual plot about the origin story of the Brotherhood of Optimus Prime and Megatron really did hit a core with its audience, because what I did get from the discourse around the live films is that a big reason why fans of the original cartoons really detested those movies is because they did, well, what every CGI hybrid film essentially does when they take nostalgic characters and turn them into live-action CGI hybrids. Somehow, the actual nostalgic characters that everyone actually came to see get second billing in lieu of a forgettable live-action lead. And now the Transformers themselves actually get to be the protagonists in their own movie, and it is easily the most interesting and engaging of what I've seen. I know that I've seen the revisionist history and the manipulative government thing pop up a lot lately, and we should honestly keep going with it because it's really important. More so that this is one of the series that really makes you sympathize with Megatron, and also have great irony in the fact that they call themselves the Decepticons. It is always a bit of a letdown when the animated incarnation, even when it's royally better, makes significantly less money than all of its live-action movies, even the ones that tanked. But what I still really like about this movie's legacy is the fact that a single Twitter account had essentially been single-handedly championing this movie, trying to do a much better job at advertising it than the studio itself did. Like, his efforts were acknowledged by the director of the movie, and he was so happy. Like, I'm so happy for him. Like, that's one of the feel-good stories of the year.
You know, it'd be cool is if we told my story with Lego pieces.
Seriously?
I am not somebody who meticulously follows the lives and careers of popular music artists, and so I can't necessarily attest to how good this is as an accurate retelling of Pharrell's story. You know, the creator of the viral Happy music video back in 2014. Kind of the only thing I know about him is that supposedly he went to the same high school as Todd in the Shadows, just not at the same time. Nonetheless, whether I'm invested in this particular music artist, or whether his biographical story feels fairly ordinary as biographical musician stories tend to go, I have immense respect that he decided to tell his story in Legos, supposedly inspired by his mentality of just seeing the world as an array of pieces that could be rearranged. I did find the creative aspect of the use of the Legos to be very inspiring and interesting, especially as I know this movie likely would have made a bunch more money if he had not made that choice. Mononoke is one of the most visually enhanced movies of the year. Based on a series of episodic supernatural mysteries caused by spirits called Mononoke that attach themselves to negative human emotions, and usually involve somebody who is recently deceased, where an entity only ever referred to as the medicine seller has to discover the mystery/secret and possibly perform therapy before the demon will show itself. The film is pretty much that concept, but on a ridiculously upped scale, in this story around women in the Emperor's harem and the incredible pressure and restrictions that are put on them. The visuals are designed to be beautiful but also disorienting, so as to hide these supernatural elements in plain sight. Enhanced again by its unnerving sound design, blending with the trippiness and the fluidity of a Yuasa film, as well as some of the scrapbook stylings that you recognize in maybe a Madoka film. There is a fourth one coming out! I saw that! It still might take like another 5 years, but I'm waiting for it. And apparently this movie was a part 1 with a part 2 that's going to come out later this year, and I'm looking forward to it. Honestly, I think I would have been just as entertained with the subtitles off.
Till you see the next thing I'm working on. A smart gnome.
As much as we may be tired of sequels, it is nice to see a renowned studio actually treat the franchise that made it with respect. Wallace and Gromit may not have been a personal favorite, but nonetheless, it is very cozy to see another installment of it. I also am one of the ones who will constantly talk about how disappointing it is that Wallace never seems to appreciate Gromit despite him saving the day all of the time. And yet, this movie does actually confront that on some level, as well as a return of one of its favorite classic villains, and tries to straddle the line between garden gnomes being creepy but also keeping them cute, a genuinely difficult tightrope. Not to mention taps into our very realistic fears of the worldwide consequences of technological glitches, filled with that classic British wit and absurdity, and I know that it's probably likely due to a contract, but I really do wish that they had the ability to have put this in theaters.
Actually, I was kind of busy this week, so I drew the whole thing in like 5 minutes. It turned out pretty good for not even trying.
Look Back has become one of the most universally praised original anime films in a while, about 2 girls brought together through being middle school manga creators, but with very different styles and personalities, the friendship they formed and the unfortunate way it ended, and the regrets that accumulated from it. Tapping into that desire and regret that everything could have been different if you just were able to change one small thing. All conveyed through the framing of differing attitudes of the creation of art. It's really amazing how personal this film feels because it's able to tap into the anxieties of a lot of young artists. I certainly get the feeling of being so intimidated by others who are so much more obviously talented than me that it saps away all of my motivation, while also acknowledging that everyone has their own style and talents, that those exact people you envy may envy you for your talent. One of the girls has obvious skill in backgrounds and realistic art, while the other does much more simplistic, almost stick figures, but has a knack for funny short stories and gags that girl was a massive fan of. It's also such a great time to talk about why people create art at a time where the attitude around art has become so much about the corporate production to the point of cutting artists out of the artistic process. Though, as tends to be the case, there are some who say that this story is better conveyed visually through the manga that it's based on. Such an emotionally saturated piece of work, I'm really glad it got the reception that it did.
Do you have any human prostitutes?
Nothing but synthetics, but we do consider ourselves 100% human. Wouldn't you agree, sir?
Always good to see a France admission. A futuristic robot-inhabited world where we follow a detective and the robot backup of her deceased partner investigating a murder that connects to why some robots are exhibiting some strange behavior. Basically, we're in the world of Blade Runner with the story of a better Will Smith's iRobot. It does such a good job establishing the chemistry between the main detective and her post-mortem partner, while the nature of his existence is definitely one of the most intriguing concepts of the movie. Like, you'd think that more would be preserving the memories of loved ones, not being their own entities, but that's kind of the theme of the film. The only note is that its ending is a little bit obvious. Still, dark, violent, and exceptionally well made.
You are defective. I feel fine. You should not feel anything at all.
Feels like the animated story of the year was the two-way race between Inside Out 2 and Wild Robot for who was going to be crowned the best animated film of the year. And a lot were rooting for Wild Robot because it was original, because DreamWorks hadn't won in a while, and Disney kind of needed to get knocked down a peg. You know, all of the superficial political reasons. Nonetheless, the odds seemed good because Wild Robot was absolutely a beautiful, emotional film of a robot taking care of a duckling and a group of animals. So why isn't it higher? Because, somewhat contradictorily, As much as I frequently love the surprising dark sense of humor many of the characters have in this film, and the efforts Roz takes to consciously learn what love means, I also felt like I liked so much of this film aesthetically that I did still kind of wish that it didn't have dialogue. I just found some of the dialogue distracting and some very minor pacing issues, but otherwise it is still an absolutely great, gorgeous film, and I'm very happy that it got a sequel.
Dad used to say that childhood was like being drunk. Everyone remembers what you did, except you.
Another stop-motion film from the creator of Mary and Max? Absolutely. This time in Memoirs of a Snail, and indeed, I feel the same sort of quirky, dark, tragic, comedic childhood story involving a pair of twins that are ultimately separated. Both honestly have pretty awful lives, but finding the ways to find joy in the simple things, and especially in their observations of the aspects of adult lives that just inevitably trickle into children's lives that no one ever thinks about. The one thing I will say about it is that in some cases it almost feels too close to Mary and Max in those themes, and I do prefer Mary and Max, but then again, complaining about that is like complaining that every single Wes Anderson movie has a reoccurring styles and motifs.
More complex now. It requires more sophisticated emotions than all of you. You just aren't what she needs anymore, Joy.
Definitely curbed a lot of people's fears that Pixar just didn't have it anymore, though it is way easier when you have a premise that has been proven to work. I'm also just glad to see that Inside Out just hit a chord with so many people in 10 years. Even as people liked it at the time, felt like so many people were like trying to find faults with it. So I'm just glad that the reception of this movie has finally shut all that up. And while personally I don't think it hits in the same way as the original, I can't deny that I really like how they've characterized anxiety and the general journey that they do with her. Sometimes I go back and forth on how they handled the sense of self, though that is a fantastic concept to use for puberty, a time where it really is the start of setting in a sense of personal values, while also being way more socially aware, while also at the same time being very socially unaware. So a lot of those values are challenged as you try to find where you belong and end up wanting to change a lot about yourself. I also really liked Dream Productions that came out that year, as sort of an Inside Out 2.5, that in a different world definitely could have been its own movie and could have premiered in theaters and probably done well. But there's no getting around the fact that because it doesn't have the same cast of characters and that all of the characters in Dream Productions are all essentially just blobs, it was never going to quite hit in the same way. And nonetheless, I absolutely love the story that they told with it, expanding on the struggles of puberty while potentially critiquing its own film studio. If you haven't seen it yet, I definitely think it's worth checking out, especially if you just want more Inside Out stuff. Also, Win or Lose. Win or Lose is really good. It is also a Pete Docter production. I think the reason that ultimately Flow took such a high spot is because it gave me what I needed. Not something necessarily relaxing, but grounded in a way, and yes, that it was completely dialogueless. Flow is essentially a very atmospheric exploratory movie about a group of animals surviving during and after an apocalyptic event. The characterization and the animal behavior of all of the animal characters is perfection. Watching animals overcome obstacles is something compellingly addictive, as well as watching animals be friends with other kinds of animals. And that's without the survivalist stakes. And no real animals got hurt in the making, I'm hoping. No Milo and Otis shenanigans here. I do understand that it might lose some people visually because it's one of those, there are movies that look like video games and then there are movies that look like video games. But especially because the entire premise in its nature of being in a completely new world with no dialogue where you're largely exploring feels very much like a video game experience. There are plenty of indie games that are literally just walk around and explore this space while something mysterious is going on. This is also the first Latvian movie to be nominated and win an award. As much as some people have been dying for DreamWorks to finally beat Disney again, I'm more happy that a much smaller film beat Disney just as well. And yet in this year, for as many great or acceptable movies that came out in this top half of films, including some of the ones that I didn't get around to talking about because I just do not have the energy, First off, as an honorable mention, I just want to praise Hundreds of Beavers again, because while it is live action, it is so inspired by, yes, silent films, but also old school cartoons complete with absurdist cartoon physics. It is so fantastically funny, and it really is my favorite live action film of last year. But as for my favorite feature-length, semi-animated experience, it comes from a much more independent and passion-filled place. And I really do want to apologize for how long this video took. I've had a bunch of life stuff going on, though haven't we all? But I know how long you guys have been waiting. Because I can't deny, Epic the Musical was a big fixation of mine this year, updating gradually in various arcs and pieces throughout the years, and finally officially ended at the end of 2024, and I am completely convinced that it is the success of this online that convinced Nolan to make his film version of it. I am convinced. This was especially hard-hitting for me as someone who has been very disappointed in Disney's musical attempts lately. And this at least pleasantly reassures me that somebody knows what the hell they're doing. And this musical, for something that is essentially someone's college thesis, really is Broadway level. And you can definitely hear the Hamilton influence in it, and I do not mean in terms of rapping, but just an excellent use of repetitive musical motifs to emphasize certain characters and ideas. The fact that you can literally just say bits and pieces like, I'm just a man, or Penelope. Literally just the fact that he has made such a pivotal, hard-hitting use of 3 notes. That's how you know that this man has an impeccable music talent. But then, of course, what I really love, that in a year where there has been so much depressing news around the corporate attitude of animation, where no matter how good a film performs, that the artists were abused or undervalued, or even if it was a success, that all of the animatics have not only been appreciated by the creator, but because they are completely self-motivated, are the definition of a passion project. Every single person that contributed something did so purely of their own volition and of their own skill and their own passion, and as such got their own respect for their own contributions. I love seeing all of these budgeting artists being able to show their abilities, all of their own unique styles, their designs, their interpretations. I know that Epic as a fandom, like all fandoms, is not devoid of drama, but just the fact of how that this is as independent as it gets. So honestly, this is what I would consider to be the true crowning achievement of animation in 2024, and it wasn't even a fully animated project. Anyway, phew, we're done. We can move on to this year. I'm sorry about the time, but then again, you can understand why I've been so reluctant to acknowledge that this year exists.